Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, in some countries, property prices are crashing big time, and we will bring you the numbers and tell you about those countries. But most important of all, we'll tell you what it means for the UK property market.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning we share a little bit of what we've learned from spending our time full-time in property, advising a fund and arranging hundreds of transactions every year. So today we're off on a tour around the world, and you're going to hear some big and very surprising numbers as we do that. And then stick around to the end, because in Hub Extra we've got an effortless way for you to save some money.
So for our news story of the week, we've got to talk about inflation, because the good news is inflation is down. And that's great. It's down to 8.7% from 10.1% in March. So for April's figures, the latest figures, which have just come out, inflation is down to 8.7%. What I found interesting though, Rob, is that minutes after the announcement was made, one of our mortgage brokers quickly got in touch and they said, well, inflation is down, but swap rates are going up. And I was like, what? That's a bit confusing, but there's a reason why that's the case, Rob, because you would expect, logic would dictate that, oh, well, if inflation is down, then swap rates will improve as well. But there is a reason why they haven't.
That's right. At first, it makes no sense, but it's because everything is based around expectations. So everyone knew that inflation would fall this month. And the reason for that is a big change in energy prices, which happened now just over a year ago, have dropped out of the 12-month calculation, which is how inflation is calculated. So everyone knew as a result of this, it was going to come down. In fact, the market expectation was that it would come down further. The consensus, I think, was that it would come down to 8.2%, and the Bank of England thought it would be lower as well. Bank of England wrong isn't exactly new news these days, but they thought it would be lower too. So because it came in higher, the belief is now that the Bank of England is going to need to keep interest rates higher for longer to bring inflation under control, because it's not coming under control of its own accord. That, in turn, means that when lenders are pricing up fixed-rate mortgages using swap rates, which is what you just alluded to, those have gone up. Because previously they were being priced on the basis that, okay, rates are here now, but they're going to come down. So over the 5 years, they're going to be roughly this. Now they're being priced on the basis of, okay, they're here now. Maybe they'll go up a bit. Maybe they'll stay higher for a couple of years before they start coming down. Therefore, over the course of that 5 years, the fixed rate that they think they need to charge you in order to come out ahead, basically, is higher. That's a slightly simplified, but kind of accurate enough explanation of what's happened. And I'm glad we have explained it, Rob, because like you said, at first, it doesn't make any sense. Inflation's coming down, therefore rates should go down. But that's not quite how it works.
Yeah, Rob, it is all a little confusing, but don't worry, everyone. In a few weeks' time, we're going to bring on a mortgage expert to help us and you through all the noise and ultimately make the best decisions. And that's what we all want with mortgages, right? The news is all interesting, but what should we do? Well, we're going to get to that in a few weeks' time when we bring on a mortgage expert. And we are looking for other experts or experts in the making, because we are recruiting for portfolio managers right now. Portfolio managers work with our clients at Property Hub Invest to help them understand their investment goals and then guide them towards it. It's a great role, and this role is a hybrid role, with the days in the office being in Manchester. If you're interested in finding out more or even possibly applying, then head over to propertyhub.net/jobs. We look forward to hearing from you and chatting to you a bit more about the role.
It's not just the UK that's been on a property roller coaster for the last few years. In fact, when you go and look at other countries around the world, the UK suddenly seems pretty pedestrian. As we take a trip around the world in this episode and take a look at what's happened with global house prices, you are going to hear some big numbers that might just shock you. Once we got through those numbers, we'll then get to the important bit. What can we take away from this in terms of lessons for what's happening now in the UK and what's likely to happen in the future?
Well, I'm quite excited to go around the world, Rob, especially after the weather that we've had in the UK for the first part of this year. So let's start going around the world and bringing you those property numbers. Now, you're going to hear quite quickly, there are two very distinct groups here. So let's start with the wowzer numbers. So first and honest is Canada, down a whopping 15%. Now that is a crash. Sweden, not far behind, down 14%. Going down under now, New Zealand 14% down, and Australia 9% down. So some major fallers there. And while our global economy is absolutely linked, it doesn't mean that all property markets act the same, because we have another group. Germany down just 2.5%. The US down only 2%. For all the noise, the US only down 2%. Netherlands down 2.5%. And our neighbours, France, flat. No falls at all. So Rob, you've got two big groups there. And let's start with the major fallers, because while they're grabby numbers, how have they happened? Why do we think those falls have been so big?
Well, there's a few reasons, but the biggest one, in my opinion, is a very simple one, which is that they'd previously gone up the most. So take Canada, where there's been a 15% fall from the peak so far, and I believe in some of the major cities it's actually more than that. Well, Canada previously had a huge house price increase during the pandemic, went up about 40% during the pandemic, which is about double what happened in the UK. Similar story in Australia and Sweden. In all three of those countries, house prices have more than doubled since 2007, whereas in the UK, it's 50%, and in America, it's 61%. So we're not exactly in the realms of sophisticated economic analysis here. It's just when something has gone a long way up, it's going to be the thing that comes down the most when conditions change. We saw a very similar thing with tech stocks as a result of the pandemic, which absolutely rocketed and then crashed back down again. And Rob, you've said it before, you need to have a boom before the crash. And those countries did have the boom, and now they're having the crash.
Yeah, it's us just applying our common sense economics. But you normally have to see a large boom to see a large crash. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have a crash, but the crash will be so less severe if you haven't had the mania before. Rob, you've already said that Australia, Canada, Sweden have all seen prices more than double since 2007. Well, America, in that same time period, has seen property price growth of just 61%. And the UK, which we will come to shortly, is even less than that.
There are other factors at play as well, though, and the way that different countries operate their mortgage markets is another important factor. So in the US, it's common to get mortgages that are fixed for like 30 years. So you lock in your interest rate at the start. So if mortgage rates then go up after you've bought, who cares? It doesn't make much of a difference. Whereas in Sweden, most mortgages are variable from the start. So as soon as interest rates go up, everyone's housing costs go up. So you see an immediate impact in terms of how much people are able to pay for housing. In the UK, of course, we're somewhere in between, and we'll come to that in a minute. There's also the factor of household debt. So how stretched are consumers already in the face of interest rates going up? And that's something else that the big fallers have got in common. So Denmark, Australia, Canada, Sweden all have particularly high household debt, which means, again, as interest rates go up, everyone has more debt to service, so it affects them more severely. Let's face it, property investment can be a lot of hard work, but it can be fun and it can be very profitable as well. But with our app portfolio, our aim is to keep the fun and to give you exposure to the potential benefits of property investing without having to do any of the work. So to learn more about Portfolio, just go to portfolio.co.uk or search Portfolio on the App Store.
So where does this leave the UK? Well, somewhere between the US and Sweden in terms of mortgages. Household debt is middle of the pack. And house price growth has not been anywhere near as extreme. We said America had grown by just 61% since 2007. And the UK, well, just 50%. And when we started to look at house price growth for this episode, we came across some really interesting data, and we'll be sure to do a podcast or a YouTube video on this in the not too distant future, which is property prices and how long it takes for them to double in the UK. So you would have heard us talk about that the average is around 10 years. And the data shows that. Since the Second World War, roughly speaking, the average it takes for UK property to double in price is roughly 10 years. Now, the longest since the Second World War has been 14 years. But when we look at what happened after 07 and 08 and when property prices bottomed out, and that was in spring of 2009, well, property prices at that point in time, at that bottom after the crash, settled at £155,000. So the average UK property price was £155,000. So we are 14 years on. Have we done it? No. The average property price in the UK, according to the Land Registry, is currently £290,000. So for it to be double, it would need to be £310,000. So we're still a bit short of that. And I don't think we're going to see any major growth this year in the UK market. So we are in new territory here. This is the longest it's ever taken for property prices to double since the Second World War. There's no boom there. People have said that we've seen a boom over the last however many years in the UK. We absolutely haven't. What we have witnessed, and no one's talked about, and we haven't talked about until today, because I'll be honest, we only stumbled across this data, is that it's the longest it's ever taken for property prices to double. And we'll see how long it takes, but it could be 15 years, maybe more. But the point is that we have not seen a boom. If far from a boom, we've seen the most subdued house price growth in the UK since the Second World War. So even with interest rates on the up, a crash does not make sense right now, because you need a bit of frenzy, you need a bit of high growth to see a big crash. And that simply hasn't played out.
So what does this trip around the world tell us about what's going to happen in the UK? Well, as ever, we're talking about what's going to happen in the future. So you can have your own view and argue about how to interpret the data. But in many ways, the UK is in between those two groups that we've talked about in terms of the different variables involved. Therefore, it would make sense if it had an outcome somewhere between the two as well. But for me, there's also some interesting lessons that we can take for this and apply to our investments within the UK, whatever is happening in the market. Because as we've already seen, it's the countries where property was already the most expensive, where prices are falling fastest, and where they'd had the most rapid recent increase. But what we haven't covered, which is very much true, is that within each country, it's also the most expensive cities that have been falling fastest. So within Canada or Sweden or wherever else, it's the big global cities where house prices are high that have also suffered the most. So you can take this and apply it to where you invest in the UK. And the obvious example here is London. London had a lot of growth very early in this cycle. It's the most expensive city in the UK, and it's a city where affordability is most stretched. Therefore, it would make sense if London prices did worse in a difficult market than anywhere else. And I know that's not exactly breaking news. It's something that we said would happen at the start of the year. It's something that is already happening, and it's kind of obvious. But the point is, it's London now. It might be somewhere else next time around. So by understanding some of these principles, you don't have to listen to anyone else's opinion, including ours, of what's going to happen. You can apply some of these patterns that you see over and over again in different ways throughout the world and use those to come to your own judgments about how you invest.
So why have we done this? Well, to show you that while there's some scary numbers out there, things might not be that scary in the UK. Now, are conditions in the UK all rainbows and unicorns and everything's fine? Don't worry, guys. Of course not. But what we try our very best to do here on the podcast is bring you balance and bring you information beyond the headlines. The headlines around the world are quite scary right now. But as you've heard, there's plenty of countries that are just flat or falling ever so slightly, a bit like the UK. And there's very much reasons why there is that disparity between the major fallers and those that aren't really falling right now. And you can also take comfort in understanding the reasons behind that. So headlines can be and often are scary, but knowledge is your comfort blanket. For when the headlines get scary, keep informing yourself. Keep listening to the podcast and other good sources of information to make sure that you really understand what's going on, because then you can make informed investment decisions rather than irrational ones. And if you follow the headlines, as we've said so many times before, it will cost you money.
Time now for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we bring you a little something extra, whether it's an idea, a tool, a book, or sometimes, Rob, like today, a way to save money.
We love telling you how to make money, but we also like to save you money as well. And this week's extension actually comes from producer Dan, so thank you, Dan. And this extension is called Honey. And you can find Honey at joinhoney.com, but you can also find it in your browser extension as well. It works on Chrome, it works on Brave. I'm not sure if it works on other browsers. You could check that out. But what this app does, and it's brilliant at doing it, is when you go shopping, it automatically searches for coupon codes for you. How many times have you got to checkout and you haven't got a coupon code and you've seen there's a box for it and then you think, oh, am I overpaying? Is there a code out there? And you subsequently go off on the hunt for that coupon code. But there are so many spammy websites out there, it's hard to know what's real and what isn't. Well, do not worry, do not fear, no more. Honey will help you. It's absolutely free. You'll help you find the coupon codes if they exist, and if they don't, it'll tell you. And I'm sure you will quickly start to save money if you use this extension. So check it out, joinhoney.com, or search for it in the Chrome store. You'll find it nice and easy to install. It's got really good reviews as well. Over 17 million people using it. So well worth checking out.
Well, that is us done for this week. Thank you so much for joining us for our little world tour. We'll be back next Thursday, of course, with another episode of the Property Podcast. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.